Some believe they are the souls of the condemned, turned to stone to remind others of the price of sin. Others say they are demons and devils spared eternal damnation. Atop his cathedrals, they maintain a constant vigil, allowing no evil to enter. They can inspire dread or elicit laughter. Born of divine devotion, their mission remains mysterious. Why were they created? To what realm do they belong? Perhaps the modern scholars are right. Perhaps gargoyles are, at most, ushers into the realm of the human imagination. Or perhaps the ancient tales are true, and they really do serve as guardians at the gates of God's church. One thing is certain. Centuries after their original appearance, gargoyles are still sentinels, marking the passageway between the world of today and that of a darker but more magical age. Where do gargoyles come from? One story from the year 600 AD tells of the dragon which prowled the river Seine near the town of Rouen, outside Paris. It terrorized the townfolk, devouring ships and men. The dragon's name, Gargoyle. Finally, deliverance came in the person of Saint Romanus. To prove the might of Christianity, he set out to destroy the dragon. After a terrible battle, Saint Romanus defeated and captured the beast, delivering it to the town square, where the villagers set Gargoyle ablaze. Its body was consumed by flames, but its head and neck remained unburned. The villagers mounted the flame-proof head and neck upon the village wall, an enduring reminder of God's power. Today, the cathedral at Rouen pays tribute to the myth of Gargoyle. According to legend, the practice spread. The head and neck of Gargoyle became the model for gargoyles for centuries to come. The greatest age of the gargoyle started some 500 or 600 years later, during the medieval period which lasted from 900 AD into the 1500s. It was a time of intense superstition, bloody continental wars, and chaotic upheaval. Religion battled barbarism, and the powers of Christendom fought among themselves.
Now, there are many theories about what these images represent. Some people think that it goes back, and this is sort of a kind of Jungian approach, it goes back to deep-rooted elements within human nature. And there is a love for the grotesque in human nature, and this is why people go to see horror movies today. There's a certain titillation in it. You know, you see something in a horror movie and you become frightened of it, but you know it can't really hurt you.
Gargoyles were a way of embodying the frightening and alluring dimension of the transcendent. The Middle Ages genuinely believed in the demonic. That is, not only was our world controlled by God, but there were lesser forces in the universe. And these lesser forces had some immediate control over all of our lives. So gargoyles were a way of embodying those frightening dimensions, if you will, of our world.
There's a human dimension to gargoyles. It involves a kind of community of looking, that people come and look at them, they find their favorite gargoyle, they bring their friend and say, hey, look at this one. And this community of looking would certainly match the community of making. In other words, the artisan would cut a wonderful figure. They would spend a few days working on this or that, and they would say to their friends, come see what I've done.
But if you see gargoyles as part of something that is what all of life, all of a city, all of a country, all of a civilization is about, then they have a very deep meaning.
But what exactly is a gargoyle? First, a vocabulary lesson.
Gargoyle comes from the old French word gargouille, and it means throat. And if you look at the gargoyles themselves, they are water spouts at the roof level of the building, and they are formed of a face at the end of a long spout or a long throat.
The English words gurgle and gargle share the same French root as the word gargoyle. Today, in architecture, any drain pipe leading off the side of a building is technically referred to as a gargoyle, even if it bears no decoration whatsoever. If a stone carving does not carry water, but does bear a horrible face or image, architects call it a grotesque. Strange beasts or monsters that combine the characteristics of two or more animals are called chimeras. Figures that serve as corbels, the architectural term for a bracket, are often called corbel grotesques. Traditionally, gargoyles were placed on the walls, spires, and flying buttresses of Gothic cathedrals. Unsurprisingly, the Gothic style has been called God's architecture. France is home to the greatest Gothic cathedrals in the world. Most of its existing 93 cathedrals were constructed in the Middle Ages. The two greatest of these are Notre Dame and Chartres. Notre Dame, built within the city of Paris, is probably the most famous cathedral in the world. Though the hunchback of Notre Dame may be only legend, the gargoyles that grace the cathedral's spires are very real. They are rumored to take flight after dark and watch over the cafes of Paris. Unfortunately, cathedrals are not immune to the ravages of the elements. Most cathedrals require constant repair. They are so large that by the time one area is restored, another is in need of attention. The nearby Our Lady of Chartres is considered by many to be the greatest single example of high Gothic architecture in the world. No other cathedral is of such singular and consistent quality. The current structure is the sixth on the site. It was created at an astonishing pace, built in only 26 years upon the foundation of the fifth cathedral, which was destroyed in 1194. Both Chartres and Notre Dame are studded with gargoyles at every level. As with most great cathedrals, much of the most fanciful stonework simply cannot be seen from the ground with the naked eye. But that doesn't mean the gargoyles don't have a bird's eye view of the mortals below. As water carriers, gargoyles face a particular occupational hazard: erosion. Few of the gargoyles at the great cathedrals last more than a century. Over the millennia, many have been washed away. But thanks to constant attention, most have been replaced or restored, though some are unrecognizable or obscured. Whose face graces this beast? A tormented soul encased in stone? Or merely the visage of some mason's boss or noisy neighbor? Who are these faces supposed to be? And how long will it be before this gargoyle turns to dust and falls to the street below? It might seem strange that a church dedicated to the gospel would adorn its greatest cathedrals with these fearsome beasts. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a church leader and advisor to kings and popes, raised the issue almost 900 years ago. Of what use to the brothers reading piously in the cloisters are these ridiculous monstrosities, these prodigies of deformed beauty? There on one body grow several heads, and several heads have one body. Here a quadruped wears the head of a serpent, and the head of a quadruped appears on the body of a fish. Almighty God, if we are not ashamed of these unclean things, we should at least regret what we have spent on them. But spend on them they did. Over the centuries, several theories have emerged to explain why. The first is that gargoyles and grotesques are part of what is called the scripture in stone, an attempt to preach the gospel to the warring and illiterate clans of pagan Europe. During a time when few could read, the church sought to propagate the faith through awesome displays of stained glass and sculpture. A few scholars believe that gargoyles were inspired directly by passages in the Bible. Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me, like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water. My heart has become like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. Others hold that gargoyles don't come from the Bible at all. Some believe these carved creatures were inspired by the skeletal remains of prehistoric beasts. Still others argue that gargoyles are an expression of mankind's subconscious fears. One historical explanation of gargoyles is that they are vestiges of paganism, holdovers from an age when people believed the gods could be heard in the whispering trees and the babbling rivers. Many gargoyles are similar to the legendary figures and gods of the ancient Celts. The Green Man, also known as the Jack of the Green, was the pagan god of tree worship. To this day, across Europe and America, one can find grotesques wearing crowns of leaves and branches. Another common image from paganism is the multi-faced grotesque. Three-faced gods of the Celts were once used to represent the Holy Trinity, until the Pope banned the practice. Could these figures be direct descendants of Celtic gods, never entirely defeated by the Church?
Masons and sculptors, like all human beings, draw from the traditional culture from which they come. But these images, and these images do reflect the pagan cultures, or the pre-Christian cultures is probably a better term. These do reflect the pre-Christian cultures from which these people emerged. However, these images are part of a programmatic whole that the church believed in.
Perhaps gargoyles served as a reminder that even when God is at hand, evil is never far away.
We find in the Christian scriptures and in the Jewish scriptures as well some element of the demonic. St. Paul clearly believed that Christ had triumphed over the demons of the middle air, who had somehow a responsibility for creating the evil in our world. Evil was produced not only by human choice, which the story of Adam and Eve was meant to provide an allegory for, but demons also somehow tempted us, drew us toward evil. And this was an understanding that evil was not totally under our control. Just by trying to organize ourselves better, a little better discipline, we would not be able to overcome evil. And so it became important to embody the images of the demonic in the society to indicate that this force was larger than ourselves. And gargoyles provided a way of indicating that that force was bigger than we were.
Gargoyles were also a source of popular entertainment. In an age without movies or books, stone carvers were the Steven Spielbergs and Stephen Kings of their day, providing folks with a good scare, and sometimes a good laugh. Whatever their origin, gargoyles still tell us something about how an earlier society saw the world.
I think what gargoyles tell us about the church and the society of the Middle Ages is that they were much more accepting, perhaps, than we are, of this frightening dimension of our world. They were able to bring into their world these gargoyles and feel that by bringing them in, those gargoyles were controlled in some way by the supernatural. God was in charge of the universe. Gargoyles were simply a part of the world, but God was in charge of demons. And so an image of gargoyles meant that we knew that God continued to be in charge of the world.
Many scholars have wondered about these sculptures on churches and in cathedrals. Where do they come from? Why are they placed there? And when we think about it, you have to think about a number of aspects of society. You have to think about who commissions the works. You have to talk about what role the artist plays in terms of how much freedom did the artist have in what he placed where in the cathedral. You have to think about who is going to be looking at these works of art. Are they going to be looked at just by a monastic establishment, by monks, or are you looking at a greater number of people, common people, looking at these works? Other scholars have believed that it is in these marginal areas of the church, way up high, where not too many people can see, where not too many people wander, that the artist had greater freedom to express very base appeals of society, that he was no longer restricted in those areas to moralistic teachings.
If modern scholarship can tell us only so much about why gargoyles have endured, legends and myths may actually tell us more. The most common legend is that gargoyles are condemned souls, intercepted on their way to hell. God places them atop churches to remind the living of what might happen if they do not renounce sin and find redemption in the Lord. Another legend says gargoyles are demons that act as stone-carved scarecrows, keeping even more terrible spirits away.
Now, other people will contend that, in fact, some of these figures, actually have a moralistic content, that these are placed there on particularly the outside of the church to warn sinners against sinning. In addition, I guess I should mention another, and that is that these form some sort of apotropaic function. That is a magical sign against evil.
The most terrible spirit of all is, of course, the devil. In Christian iconography, the victory of God over the devil is often symbolized by a dragon curled or crushed at the foot of a saint or an apostle.
In this way, the beast becomes a sign of evil, and the triumph is the human ability to transcend over evil. And there is obviously a moral lesson to be learned. If Christ, a human being, can triumph over evil in this way, then so can you and I as human beings. I think, on the other hand, that the medieval church did not want to allow this triumph to be definitive. In other words, we don't finally kill the dragon. The dragon is still alive, and the dragon still lives. The beast still lives. It is still alive and well in 1,000 gargoyles on our cathedral.
But every carved creature symbolizes something, and in the Middle Ages, sometimes many things.
Any image may serve a number of different functions, so these are not necessarily mutually exclusive reasons, but exemplify the multi-layered aspects of a complex culture, because the Middle Ages is as complex as we are today.
Chimeras are typically part goat, part reptile, and part lion. The basilisk is a particularly reviled creature who, according to wives' tales, could be found in the roofs of old houses. The basilisk was said to be born from the satanic mating of venomous toads and roosters. During the 15th century, syphilis spread throughout Europe. It was believed to be caused by the venom of the basilisk. An old poem explains how to kill this creature by using a mirror to return its deadly gaze. To eye of basilisk that e'er with venom slew, returns the looking glass the beast's death-bringing gaze. So to themselves returns the evil sinners do, and what more fitting than its poison end their days. This small dragon, called an aspic, is often depicted with one ear to the ground and the other clogged with the tip of its tail, symbolizing the refusal of the sinner to listen to the word of God. But not all gargoyles are evil. The griffin usually combines two noble animals, a lion's body with the head and wings of an eagle. Griffins are creatures of many ages and cultures. Their nature is a metaphor for the duality of Christ, who was of both flesh and God. During the Middle Ages, animals were not merely wildlife, livestock, or pets. Everyday creatures were capable of mystical power. In 1474, a chicken was tried and sentenced to death for laying a basilisk's egg. In 1394, a pig was tried and hung for sacrilege. His crime, eating a communion wafer. Even the simple crowing of a rooster was sometimes considered the devil's work. In the bestiary of gargoyles and grotesques, the most innocent of creatures can have ominous or glorious significance. For example, the frog is often a symbol for lewdness. Elephants were among the forces of God. They could also represent the biblical Adam. Why? It was believed a male elephant wouldn't mate until given a mandrake root by a female elephant. The mandrake symbolized the apple of the Garden of Eden. Eagles were noble, if prideful creatures. Eagles were sometimes considered arrogant because they gazed into the distance instead of looking at what was nearby. However, they were great slayers of snakes and dragons and often symbolized the resurrected Christ. Because pelicans feed their young from a pouch, it was thought they sacrificed their own blood for others. This was a metaphor for Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Bats were particularly powerful, and the devil is often shown wearing the wings of a bat. But bats could also be used for protection. People nailed them to the doors of their homes to ward off evil. Bats also adorn the walls and spires of many a cathedral. A powerful beast, the lion is not always a symbol of good. The story of Daniel in the lion's den is a parable for the dangers God can place in the pilgrim's path. But the lion just as often represents the authority of God over his subjects. Cats, particularly popular on French cathedrals, were not just household companions. Cats hunted at night, and when they fed, it was not always on mice. But all the gargoyles on the famous French cathedrals are not fearsome or demonic. Many satirize or pay tribute to monks, bishops, and laymen. In fact, satire is an important element in the gargoyles' migration. Oxford University was founded as a school for the clergy over 800 years ago. Some of the greatest writers and thinkers in the English-speaking world have walked these cobblestone streets and tree-lined paths. Alas, as with Notre Dame and Chartres, wind and weather have taken their toll on Oxford's gargoyles and grotesques. A leading soldier in the battle against the elements is Percy Quick. Since 1959, he has been a stone carver at Oxford, restoring the statuary and making new gargoyles. He works for Axtell Perry Sim Masonry Limited, a firm that has dutifully tended the gargoyles of Oxford for over a century and a half.
The trade hasn't changed at all in the last few centuries because basically the tools are the same, apart from we do use compressed air now. But the stone's the same, that hasn't changed and not likely to change. It does vary in quality and texture, but the actual trade hasn't changed to my knowledge anyway.
But something has changed. Highly skilled craftsmen like Percy Quick remain loyal to the carver's craft. But the gargoyles they carve are more comic and less demonic than those of 20 generations ago. Court jesters were always popular as grotesques. Perhaps that explains Mr. Quick's latest project, a grotesque of Bob Hope. Even former American presidents can't escape caricature. Oxford's most demonic grotesques are more like Halloween masks than malevolent spirits. These gargoyles don't seem particularly concerned with your eternal soul. Perhaps they are too consumed by their eternal headaches. This man is trying to keep a bat from escaping his head. And if you look closely, this fellow is holding a snake tight to his chest. Could this be his inner demon, or perhaps his inner child? Maybe these gargoyles simply reflect the anxieties of the modern age. Others are of a decidedly older vintage and in need of Mr. Quick's quick attention. Here, the king and queen look quite fine, but the prince has probably seen better days. But then again, we knew that. Gargoyles are clearly popular here at Oxford. Apparently, it's even good luck to throw coins in them. Some traditions continue. Carvers find their inspiration close to home. Tony Walker, another mason and lifelong friend of the Gargoyles.
The craftsman or mason would do them because he worked with a team of master masons, and in the master masons, he may have somebody he didn't like, or in places like this, a don or a lecturer he didn't like, and he would put his face in the grotesque. Maybe evil, maybe poking the tongue out, or showing his teeth, especially in medieval times, and even now, and we've got bosses that we don't like, and we would do the same. Getting back at them for time immemorial.
Many of them can be seen along the walls of Magdalen College. The surveyor in charge seems to be listening forever to a lewd toad and a not-too-evil dragon. The former managing director of Axtell Perry Sim is lionized, literally. The site foreman has grown a beard, perhaps to hide the resemblance. Beside him is Mr. Quick, who seems a bit less angelic. And the carvers did not spare the residents of the college. The bosses of Magdalen College are honored along St. Edmund's Hall. Reverend Kelly, the former principal and an avid squash player, may have to wait quite a while for a match. Reverend Midley and Fred, photographed here with Fred's proxy, William. Mr. Alton was college bursar. Perhaps if you're a grotesque, you really can take it with you.
And there's one of myself up on Magdalen Tower in Oxford, which has been likened to Prince Charles for some reason.
Over the years, Oxford became a model for universities around the world, including the New World. Princeton University in New Jersey might be described as a modern-day Oxford. Founded as a Presbyterian seminary, it grew to become one of America's top schools. And as a secular institution, one might think that it would have no place for gargoyles. Don't be so sure. This unseeing reader may symbolize the mission of the university, to open the eyes of the unlearned. This gargoyle, one of Princeton's most famous, is called the literate ape. The subject of the ape's lecture remains unknown, but perhaps he is instructing this nearby football player on the perils of ignoring his studies. Even at Princeton, the power of ancient symbols has not faded completely. On the door of the university chapel, there is the figure of a chained dragon. Could this be the same gargoyle that St. Romanus burned in the town square at Rouen? Yeah. Some images have evolved. Carved monkeys may have been common 8 centuries ago, but back then, they did not carry cameras. While the cathedrals depict saints and prophets to inspire religious faith, Princeton has Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Graham Bell, who inspire faith in progress and science. Every community celebrates its heroes, and Princeton is no exception. Gladiators of the gridiron are commonplace on the campus. This tribute to American veterans was sculpted after World War I. It is placed alongside the likeness of another honored warrior, St. George. As with the cathedrals of old, few images carry a single message. Did the rectors of Princeton understand the full meaning of the creatures they placed upon the geology building? Perhaps, in a small way, this dinosaur supports the theory that gargoyles are based on monsters from a prehistoric age. And, for that matter, these pterodactyls bear a certain family resemblance to the great gargoyles of old. Because it walked backward, the crab in ancient times was a symbol of misfortune. But this one isn't going anywhere. Gargoyles have not restricted their migration to the walls and spires of academia. In fact, they have selected their perches to look upon almost every facet of modern life. No place in America has more gargoyles per square mile than New York City. And it's not only because New York is home to 18 cathedrals, more than any other city in the world. St. John the Divine in New York is already the world's largest cathedral, and it is still under construction. Gargoyles, grotesques, and other carved creatures perch amidst the scaffolding and spires of this great building.
The cathedral has many, many, many gargoyles, and some are sort of technical gargoyles in the sense that they have the original function of a gargoyle, which was a water spout. But the name gargoyle really has moved from just water spout gargoyles to sort of grotesques and to human, animal, joke kind of sculpture on cathedrals. I like them all, but they're of different categories. At the, on the portals are some gargoyles that are really sort of fantastic beasts. And those go back 50 years. I mean, they weren't recently carved. In the current building period, and this is the third period of building at the cathedral, our young apprentices have done some very, very amusing gargoyles that are very modern, but that use myths and sort of traditions of gargoyles. There's one wonderful one of a large animal eating a man. And you see the man's buttocks and legs hanging out of the lion's mouth. Well, that's one of my favorite ones. Gargoyles are an expression that came out of the Middle Ages of art forms that you find in religions throughout the history of the human family in all parts of the world, which are humorous and are also frightening. A man being eaten by a lion is sort of frightening, but you just read a little bit of Freud or Jung or depth psychology, and those kinds of images are what all of us have in our dreams, and they're part of life. And that is really the deeper meaning of this kind of sculpture in religious buildings. You're dealing with the whole human person, the whole life of people, and their aspirations and their fears, and those sides of the human personality are carved in stone. I mean, they're really there, part of a holy place.
Some of the stonework at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine reflects distinctly modern concerns.
Another one that's very modern, of course, is the head of Nelson Mandela, and that's very of the moment. Another one that I love is of a African American and a Caucasian man sort of interlocked like this, which again is a very New York reality of who lives in New York and working together.
Much of the sculpture follows in the tradition of Chartres at Notre Dame, retelling age-old stories, though sometimes with a modern twist. Master sculptor of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, Simon Verity.
There's a piece below the statue of Isaiah here, which is, he sees the destruction of Jerusalem, and so you've got a mushroom cloud blowing Manhattan apart. Below the statue of Ezekiel, there's carvings of skulls in the process of having life put into them. And that's Ezekiel's vision of a valley of dry bones coming to life. Our problem is to make the writing, as it were, as clear and as legible as possible. And if the language is unknown, that's for someone else to interpret.
Many of the gargoyles and grotesques conjure up dark images that have endured for centuries. This face is reminiscent of the three-sided pagan gods of yore. And here is a Green Man, or Jack of the Green, feeling right at home high atop Gotham. And even Reverend Morton's favorite harkens back to medieval tales of giants who feast on human flesh. In a metropolis that is often called a modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah, it's not just the famous buildings that need gargoyles.
When you look around the buildings, particularly in New York, there are a lot of very wild carvings of grotesques and gargoyles that are put there facing out to ward off evil. You'll see them above doors, above windows, and high up. There's some extraordinary bat-like carvings which would frighten anybody off.
Gargoyles can even be found on Wall Street, the capital of world finance. Some say that the true religion of modern America is money. So it may be fitting that in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, there's a building some call the Cathedral of Commerce. Finished in 1913, the Woolworth Building was the world's tallest until 1930, when the Empire State Building was completed. And at the insistence of its builder and namesake, Frank Woolworth, it brought Gothic architecture into the age of the skyscraper. In its time, it was a wonder. The 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition declared it the most beautiful building in all the world erected to commerce. Sticking to the principle that made him rich in the first place, Woolworth paid for the construction in cash. Well known for his strict bookkeeping, the 5 and dime magnet can be seen in the lobby, counting his coins. And here, the building's architect, Cass Gilbert, cradles his creation. And because everyone deserves some credit, the rental agent can be seen closing a deal. Instead of Bible stories, the building's exterior is a tribute to capital and labor, supply and demand, commerce and banking. But high above the hustle of Wall Street, less worldly carvings can be found. These 26th floor dragons are almost impossible to see from the street. Gargoyles on the higher levels are virtually invisible. Why put them here, on the 26th, 49th, and 51st floors, many times higher than the tallest cathedrals in Europe? Could it be that even Frank Woolworth realized that it pays to ward off chaos and confusion, especially in the world of business? Sacred or profane, demonic or satirical, nowhere in America have gargoyles found a more accommodating home than the Washington National Cathedral. It is officially called the Cathedral Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, but it is known to everyone as the Washington National Cathedral. Situated on some 55 acres in the heart of Washington, D.C., It overlooks the Capitol and the White House. Most of the great cathedrals of the Old World took several centuries to build. In America, where everything moves fast, the Washington National Cathedral was built at a blistering pace, taking only 87 years from start to finish. Following the age-old practice of placing churches and cathedrals as close to God as possible, the National Cathedral rests atop Mount St. Alban, Washington's highest point. It is covered with more than 200 gargoyles and grotesques of every kind. Most are real gargoyles, built to carry water from the building. No two are alike, and a great many have special stories. This gargoyle was donated by the National Cathedral Association's Missouri chapter. The bear, the symbol of Missouri, is peering through the St. Louis Arch. This well-read elephant was donated by someone who loved both the cathedral and books, the manager of the cathedral's bookstore. This cat, the night hunter, is in the grand tradition of Notre Dame. If you look closely, you will see she wears the uniform and hat of a National Cathedral docent. These two gargoyles were sculpted by the artist Peter Rockwell, son of the painter Norman Rockwell. Many of the gargoyles and grotesques of the National Cathedral carry forward the tradition of portraying symbols of evil in a satirical light. There are devils and dragons, serpents and lizards aplenty. Some do battle with each other, perhaps showing that there is dissension even among the ranks of the damned. There are frogs and locusts, cats and bats, roosters, and tortured souls. Others offer a decidedly sharp break with the past. A heart monitor, a baby ringing in the new year, a cowboy who, for at least a moment, might qualify as a tortured soul. And is there something about this gargoyle's neighbor that frightens him so? In an age when science and technology explain so many of the mysteries and wonders of life, it may seem odd that we still keep company with these strange and wondrous creatures. What is it about gargoyles that has kept them immune from the impulse of reason? What does our fascination with them tell us about ourselves?
What gargoyles may be telling us is that we don't totally have control over our social structure. We don't have control over the buildings that we build. They fall down in earthquakes. They decay. I mean, you may wonder why there are no gargoyles on Holiday Inns. Gargoyles don't belong there. Why? Because they tell us that our world is unpredictable. They tell us that the world that we're trying to control by our neatness and by our cleanliness and by our order is not a world that we can always manage. And so those gargoyles, to try and put gargoyles on a Holiday Inn would simply be odd. We're interested in ornament, but we don't want to be reminded that the world we live in day after day has that kind of unpredictability and lack of control.
Gargoyles. In the Middle Ages, they stood as guardians at the gate of God's house. Today, they are sentinels in stone to human imagination, fear, and hope. So keep an eye on the rooftops. You never know when you may spy a gargoyle, or when one may spy you.